We have in the UN TV studio today the Academy Award-winning actress and newly appointed Goodwill Ambassador for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, Mira Sorvino. Welcome, Ms. Sorvino.
Thank you.
You have been active on the issue of human trafficking even before this appointment as a UN Goodwill Ambassador. Can you tell me how you became involved in the issue?
Yes, I first became involved because I was Amnesty International's Stop Violence Against Women campaign ambassador for a few years, and that this is one of the subjects, human trafficking, that fell under the purview of that campaign. And prior to working on the campaign, I really had not understood that slavery still existed in the world in a very meaningful way. You know, like the rest of us Americans, I thought that certainly in our country slavery had ended when Lincoln freed the slaves and the Civil War was fought, and eventually, you know, we had equality in this country. But it's not the case. I mean, even within America, there's a great deal of slavery in various forms. There's sexual slave labor, there's sweatshop labor, there's migrant farm worker labor, there's child prostitution, child pornography, and it goes mostly undetected. The victims, the vast majority of them, are never found and helped. The global numbers seem to be staggering. I mean, it seems that there's potentially millions of people trafficked globally every year. And once again, the number of victims actually identified by countries that are quantifying that sort of data, as listed in the UNODC most recent report, there were only upwards of just around 22,000 victims who had been identified and sort of all their data collected. So that means that we're talking a minute amount of the actual crime that's going on that's actually being apprehended, and that the traffickers are being convicted and punished, and that the victims are achieving freedom and some kind of aid and a return to some sort of normalcy.
Now, you also did a television miniseries on human trafficking a few years back. How did that experience shape your perception of the issue?
Well, I had decided to work on the film Human Trafficking, produced by Mr. Robert Halmy Sr. and Lifetime Television, because of the work I'd been doing with Amnesty, and I thought, well, I've never really had a chance to combine my acting work and my social interests work, the advocacy that I do, as a sort of a second career in a way. And I thought this would be a great way to raise awareness on this topic. And in doing the film, I really became far better acquainted with certain elements of the topic. I spoke to ICE agents. I was playing an ICE agent. ICE is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement division of, you know, they're in the United States, but they also have a specific anti-trafficking unit. And I spoke to that anti-trafficking unit, and they were the ones who sort of told me that in the US, most cases are broken actually by concerned citizens calling in a tip because they see something next door that just doesn't look right. And that was interesting because that's why there was sort of a vital need for the idea of trafficking and the look and feel of it to be more widespread to the public, so that they could be more helpful in helping crack open cases where, you know, right next door to them, busloads of Thai workers were being kept for 8 years, you know, working as sweatshop labor, and no one said anything, even though it looked a little strange. Well, the more people understand the earmarks of trafficking and what a trafficked, you know, population looks like, and how they're fearful and don't contact anyone on the outside and don't have the same sort of freedom that most individuals have, then, you know, the more chance they'll have of achieving freedom through law enforcement. And it was interesting to see how much of a crucial role the private sector played in actually just bringing these crimes to light. I spoke with victims through CAS, the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, a great institution that is a victim services organization that tries to help victims of trafficking who've come to light and find them occupations and education and psychological counseling and housing, and just rebuild their lives for them after their lives have been basically destroyed by their experiences. And I have to say, once you meet a trafficking victim, and once you meet more than one trafficking victim, it's something that never leaves you. A person who has been owned by another person and physically abused and treated as something less than human for an extended period of time, and terrified and often raped, and their families threatened that they're going to have their children killed, or their parents killed, or their brothers and sisters killed. These kinds of methods that the traffickers use to ensnare and then keep a thrall over their victims are just the most draconian, evil forms of manipulation known to man, really. And when you see the effect that they have on a person, I mean, the only other comparable thing I could ever say is that, you know, if you've met a Holocaust victim, someone who spent time in a concentration camp and saw most of their families decimated, that same haunted, terrible trauma is in the face of a trafficking victim. Like, there's something that they will never, ever be able to get over. They are never able to completely rise above their fear. They try. I mean, it's not impossible for them to lead a normal life afterwards. But think of, you know, if 79% of the cases, as you know, reported upon in the latest report, actually, by UN GIFT and UNODC, says that 79% of the crimes are sexually related, you know, sexual trafficking, forced prostitution, etc. If a person is raped once, often that experience affects a woman or a man the rest of their life. Take a young person, say, you know, a teenage girl who's repatriated to some foreign place where she's told that there is no one looking out for her, and that if she runs away, she'll be arrested and thrown into jail, or worse yet, sent back home and then dealt with by the traffickers there. Imagine the experience of being raped basically for years on end as her services are sold as a prostitute multiple times a day at a high profit for the trafficker, beaten, kept on drugs to keep her in line. How does a person come out of that? I mean, how does a human being, you know, if you've met a rape victim, or if you know anyone who's experienced sexual violence, one incident is huge. We're talking about years of this, and just the cruelest form of inhumanity. I don't know, it's something stunning, and you see this pain that people were able to use other people in this fashion, that they saw their way clear to making a profit in this way, that this is the business that these people have chosen. And it's a big business. Organized crime is spreading their tentacles all over trafficking, because next to you know, only drugs and arms trafficking, it's the third most profitable criminal enterprise going in the world right now. And the overhead is very low for the traffickers, because the people are basically abducted. They're not, you know, or the initial price paid for them is so low, and then immediately what they reap from their services, be they sexual, be they, you know, some kind of forced labor, begging, child begging, children, soldiers in wartime conflict areas. The profit that the traffickers reap is so immense, and the upkeep that they have to spend on the people that they have stolen, because they don't care if they live or die, really. So they don't spend any money on them, on feeding them or health care or anything. It's truly profitable for them, and they've just thrown away any sense of morality or common decency, all for the love of this profit. And it's growing. It's growing around the world. It's growing in the United States, and it's just stomach turning.
As you say, it's a very lucrative business. How do you think this can be counteracted?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think that we see, you know, in the report that, you know, there have been several reports that the UNODC has prepared, but there's been a very recent one where they're studying the effects, or, you know, the results of everything that's been put together since people became signatory to the UN's protocol against trafficking. And they're looking at conviction rates and identification of victims, and trafficking affects over 130 countries worldwide. There's trafficking either within or from or to 130 countries around the world, at least. And a great number of those countries recently, their response to the crime has grown a lot in the past 2 or 3 years. They're really starting to enact legislation against it, tailoring specific legislation on the law enforcement side and on the victim services side, and trying to coordinate governmental efforts with also NGO efforts on the ground to help network and find victims and provide them with support. But one of the greatest areas of work, still yet to be done is in the area of prevention. And, previous programs aimed at preventing trafficking sort of focused on just a public awareness raising campaign side of the fence. And although that is very well and good, and as we see in the United States, that helps lead to arrests being made, because that's how people discover trafficking cases, is because people who didn't know what trafficking was, if they see a film on it or they hear a speech about it, and then they see something strange in the brothel next door, they can call it in, they know that it is a crime, they know that it is trafficking, then that helps the trafficking be discovered. However, the public awareness campaigns aimed at warning victims or potential victims of the dangers of, say, accepting foreign employment really are not that effective, because unless these potential victims have some other viable means of economic survival within their context, they often still have no choice but to take a chance on the trafficker's promise that they're going to have a good job somewhere else via them. So really part of the issue is addressing the on-the-ground conditions in the source countries that make people fall prey to becoming victims of trafficking in the first place, which is a huge, huge task. I mean, we're talking about some of the sources of vulnerability are malnutrition, extreme poverty, illiteracy, conflict, post-natural disaster areas like the tsunami created a host of vulnerable people who all of a sudden were homeless, jobless, familyless, and could be easily disappeared and turned into slave labor. But it is possible, and when we're talking about today here, we're celebrating Lincoln's birthday. And one of the things I wrote in my speech today is that Lincoln said in his second inaugural address that 1/8 of the population of the United States at that time consisted of slaves in bondage in the South. 1/8 of the American population was enslaved. And he legally found a means, and yes, there was a war to enact it, but he freed them, and it became a thing of the past. Now, unfortunately, there is a new kind of slavery, but that form of entrenched American, colonial bringing over of African nationals to use them as slaves in the United States as, farm and domestic labor was abolished. And to think that 1/8 of a population could be switched from that to free men, to the point where now we are all standing really proudly behind the election of President Barack Obama, a man of African descent, in the same position that Lincoln was in, you would have said it was impossible at that point that you could ever really make such a sweeping, gigantic change. And so to say, well, how can we eradicate those things? Obviously, world poverty and malnutrition and famine and sickness is so gigantic, we're already trying on other levels to do that. But if you have a concerted effort between law enforcement efforts at conviction, prosecution, and at making the penalties for trafficking far greater than they are now, and you work on the victim side, and you work very hard not to allow victims to slip back into it once they've been discovered and helped, and you create initiatives to create other opportunities for these people rather than just accepting the offer of the man to buy their eldest daughter. Or, there's always hope, and there's no reason for us to throw up our hands. Otherwise, we might as well just stop calling ourselves human beings. We're worse than animals if we say, well, okay, it's too hard, so we're just going to give up.
In terms of raising awareness, though, do you feel that film or art in general is a good platform to popularize this issue?
I think it was in our case, I have to say, because before that particular project, I think that the American population knew very little about the phenomenon of modern-day slavery that is trafficking. And I always have a little issue with the word trafficking, because it's correct in a way in that, yes, a person is often, within the context of this modern-day slavery, they are moved from one location to the other, although often within the same borders. I mean, most traffickers and their slaves are of the same nationality. Interestingly enough, they're mostly of the same nationality. So a person from Czechoslovakia enslaves a Czech girl. So it's not like a French guy enslaves a Czech girl. It's, they may move them out of the country, but sometimes it's also the diaspora of that ethnic group in the new land that provides the unfortunate sort of backwards railroad into enslavement in the new country. But I do think that when you, this is the question about whether films are, yeah, I think emotionally reaching people and getting them to understand that this is a human crime, not like just a criminal element thing dealing with objects being sold and bought. Because, when we think of drug trafficking, arms trafficking, we're thinking of things crossing borders and money changing hands. This is human beings. This is slavery. This is people being abused and used as dishrags, and less than dogs, less than cockroaches. I think that sometimes film or literature can give people that emotional kick in the gut that they might not have gotten had they just read an article in the newspaper about it. So I think that it might light a fire in people's bellies a little bit to take arms against it, and to also perhaps shame people in positions of power into doing more about it, people in governments who have the ability to work on enacting legislation and broadening the definition of trafficking. Because there's a very spotty collective understanding of what trafficking is, even within the countries that are signatory to the UN Protocol Against Trafficking. So what constitutes a victim? What constitutes a trafficker? In certain countries, only sexual exploitation is seen as trafficking. In other countries, the age of a child is very loosely defined, like a 12-year-old and up might be an adult in that culture. In another culture, 18 and under is a child, and anything in that age range, those are trafficked human beings in doing whatever they're doing. But yes, I do think art can help, but I don't think it's enough. I think it's just one element of the great global effort that has to happen now to put a stop to this kind of cancer that's eating into more and more countries across the globe.
And how do you feel? Last question?
Last question.
How do you feel about being appointed a UN Goodwill Ambassador? How will that help get your message across?
Well, I'm thrilled to be appointed as a UN Goodwill Ambassador. It's an enormous honor. It was actually an aspiration of mine from the time I was very young to actually work with the UN. I was hoping to do it even after I graduated college, and I wrote my thesis about racial conflict and prejudice in a specific context, in a specific country, but I always wanted to somehow put my education in terms of, prejudicial treatment and the abuse of people into some broader context that would actually have some practical application and do some good. And I think that people certainly look up to the UN in a worldwide way. I mean, I found that when I've traveled. I was just speaking at a panel on human trafficking in Egypt a few months ago, and they all take the UN extremely seriously. And I think just being a representative of the UN certainly gives me a greater platform from which to be heard. And if I am spreading the message that the UN feels appropriate to spread on this, and helping further their goals in tackling this problem from a law enforcement angle, from the perspective of the UNODC, I think maybe we really can have some effect. So I'm really honored, and I'm really thrilled to take on this challenge.
Thank you very much.